I've had the privilege to spend some time with Thomas Zweifel over the last 6 months, and I am very excited to introduce Thomas's intellect and his experience into the community. In the first session of 2022, we hope to tackle firstly the challenges that traditional planning encounters when we are looking to deliver strategic change. And secondly, Thomas is going to help us to unlock some of the hidden DNA within an organization, which can sometimes hold us back without us even realizing. Thomas, great to welcome you to Leading Minds Network. I'm very excited to have you hosting our session in March. Would you be so kind as just to share with everybody a little bit about your background, who you are and where you've come from?
Yes, absolutely. And thanks for your kind words. And it's always a pleasure to work with Andrew. Any excuse I get to talk to Andrew, listen to Andrew, work with Andrew is a good thing. So just briefly about myself, my life, and I wrote this book, Strategy and Action. My life is actually an example of strategy and action. Maybe it's a kind of a euphemism for my life because it went into a meandering way. I started my leadership career at 17 when I became a ski instructor in charge of 30 very wild kids running down the mountain in Davos in Switzerland. And that was my first leadership experience. And I made a lot of mistakes along the way. I became a CEO of a company called Swiss Consult Group a lot later. And on the way to that, I was really using strategy and action as my way to go, to basically be obsessed with the outcome, with the objective, but never be obsessed with the pathway. Always be flexible about the process or how you get there. I'm now CEO emeritus of Swiss Consulting Group. I was able to sell it in 2013, make an exit. But while I was working as a consultant, I had the great privilege to partner with 40 different CEOs and CXOs on their strategy, to build strategy alignment, to bring together the board of directors or the top level team with all the other stakeholders. And I guess we'll go deeper into that topic. I was able to work with them in such a way that they produced $9 billion in additional revenue every year. I have been privileged also to teach leadership at Columbia University and at HSG, which is St. Gallen University in Switzerland. And I'm the author of 8 books. I'm actually working on 3 other books, but I'm the author of 8 books on strategy and leadership topics like communication, culture, coaching, but really a kind of a humanistic approach to strategy. And I guess I should say I live in Zurich with my wife and our 2 daughters.
That's great. Thank you, Thomas. Very good. And if we jump into strategy and action and talking a little bit about the book, a big part of our focus for the session in March is going to be helping people to unpick the hidden DNA of their organization and understand how strategy can be done more effectively so that they can put that into action themselves. It would be really interesting just to hear your perspective, sort of framing that concept and coming out of the book. Why is traditional strategic planning failing in our current business environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, there's different answers to this. One answer is we're living in a world, and you may have heard this term called VUCA world. VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And it basically means we're living in a minefield. We're living in a very unpredictable environment that can change very rapidly. Just take one example, the COVID-19 pandemic that has basically ravaged the planet since early 2020. It's now over 2 years already that we've lived in this very unpredictable environment. And I always say, I'm so glad I'm not sitting in the government because it's so hard to plan and to foresee and predict the changes that will happen. It's a little bit like a black swan environment, right? Where you have the super issues coming up out of left field and you have no idea what hits you. So we're living in that kind of a business environment, and that's very, very hard to plan inside of. It used to be that there was a Japanese company called Matsushita, which had a 250-year plan. Imagine that, 250-year plan. But now, you can barely see what's going to happen next week or next month and next quarter, let alone the next 5 years. So basically, in my view, we need a new approach to strategic planning. But not only because of that reason, there's two other reasons. Number one, planning is traditionally separated from implementation. So basically, if I go into a company and just match this against your company and see how it's done, I have so often seen that people in the boardroom would basically come up with some usually financial projections, usually some forecasts, and say, this is our strategic plan. Then they would show some slides to the workforce or to middle management and basically say, now go and implement this strategy. But the planning and the implementation were basically divorced from each other, right? So what we need a new approach that actually marries those two again, so that it's not like, it's hashed out behind closed doors in a boardroom and then people are expected to implement, which they never do, right? So people only implement, in my view, what they helped create. So that's one thing that's wrong. And then the second thing that's really a limitation of traditional planning is that it's basically the human being who is basically the implementer is thought of as an afterthought. It's like, okay, oh yeah, we have to move all these people from Atlanta to a low-cost region because of our strategy. And people are basically like an object in the strategy rather than the key change agents or the key agents of the strategy. So in my view, we need a new approach that will put people at the center as the key agents, because they're the ones that are going to implement, and that ends the divorce between basically planning and action.
Fascinating. Okay, that's really interesting. So actually, we're talking about humanizing strategy and really recognizing the people at the heart of this, both from a design and implementation perspective, and making that one cohesive play from a strategic planning design perspective.
Exactly.
And if you think about that, it's interesting to think about where strategy gets implemented. So this environment we're in and the world we've been in for some time now, what are the early challenges for a leader who's trying to implement strategic change, given what you've just described around the issues in planning in the first place?
Yeah, I think there's several challenges. I would say one challenge is, how do I get the right people in the room? I mean, if this is true, if we assume that it is actually the case that people will only implement that which they helped create, right? That unless you're engaged in the creation or the design, you're not going to be engaged in the implementation. And look for yourself, right? I mean, if ever you were working with a boss who just simply told you to do something and didn't give you any background, didn't give you the kind of bigger picture of why you were doing this, it's very hard to take an action, right? You just don't own it. You don't believe in it. So the first challenge is, how do I get the right people, and who are the right people to get into the room to actually be part of the design process? And how can I do that in a way that I don't lose control? I think that's a big part. It's a big challenge for the CEO, for example.
Yeah.
I need to involve enough of the right stakeholders, but I also want to keep control of the process, because otherwise it's just like democracy. And I'm not talking about democracy. I'm not talking about, now the CEO should be one of many. The CEO still needs to maintain the leadership of the process. Okay, so that's one challenge. I would say Another challenge is possibly the mindset. You know, do I look at strategy like a plan, like a thing, like a book, or like a set of slides, like a deck? Or do I see strategy as a kind of a living, organic, evolving process that is kind of a dynamic between action, you know, taking an action in service of a vision and then evaluating that action and then adjusting the strategy out of that action. And I think that's a very different way of doing strategy. It's a much more evolutionary way, a more organic way, less mechanistic. And I think that's one of the big challenges, that we tend to look at reality as if it was like a clock, you know, like a Swiss watch. And we were trying to get it perfect, like a mechanism. But this kind of mechanistic worldview just doesn't work anymore. We've already seen that in the 70s. We've seen it ever since quantum mechanics or the new physics. But now in this crisis, it's really become apparent that it cannot work that way. So I guess there's a kind of a mindset shift that has to happen as well.
Yeah, I mean, and we could spend a lot of time diving into that, because that is a whole minefield of what does strategic planning look like? Are you scenario planning in effect because you know there are multiple potential outcomes rather than purely one desired outcome? But perhaps better we don't dive into that now and maybe look at that with the group in the session.
We need to leave some goodies for the session, right?
We definitely do. And I love what you say. My personal leadership philosophy is that people own what they create, and our job is fundamentally to embed that into our business and help to allow those other people to create and design and implement, which is much easier in an SME. As you get into a large cap and a big corporate, then this is a wholly different challenge altogether. But it's an incredible point around culture and those underlying behaviors that all the leaders that you build around you possess, and whether they are also capable of doing exactly that thing. Can they create leaders who will allow people to own what they create? But that's and again, another topic. You refer in the book, very interestingly, to unlocking the hidden DNA of an organization. What exactly do you mean by that?
You know, I've coached CEOs and CXOs since 1984 on strategy, and I became aware that if you want to do strategy, you have to take care of culture as well. I'm going to quote one of my favorite management theorists, Peter Drucker, the late Peter Drucker, who once said, and I think this is quite famous, culture eats strategy for breakfast every time. Culture eats strategy for breakfast every time. Now, if that's the case, if that's true, you know, we see that the best strategy can come to naught because simply the culture is so pervasive and so strong and such a magnetic force field that it will literally grind everything into alignment into the status quo again. I call this the immune system of the organization. So basically, to understand what are the unexamined assumptions in the background, what's the context, what are the beliefs that are basically driving the organization towards an ineluctable outcome, what I call a predictable future, regardless of what your strategy was, regardless of your objectives, it has a certain dynamic that it will ineluctably produce that future that we don't necessarily want, right? So in order to have the strategy succeed, you actually need to take a look under the hood, if you will, into the hidden parts of the organization, into the mindset part or the culture part. And I'll give you an example. I was working with a global satellite company, aerospace and space company, space aviation, a very large one, and they were building satellites, and their satellites were basically, it took 5 years to build a satellite, but it took them 10 years, okay? So they went 100% over time and over budget. That's an obviously unacceptable outcome. And so we were asking ourselves, what's the mindset or what's the culture that gave rise to a kind of a mindset, gave rise to certain behaviors, gave rise to certain actions, and therefore to that result and that outcome. And we figured out, it took us about a day, but we figured out that the basic background conversation was, our best days are behind us. Now imagine going to work every day with that in the back of your head. And it's not like you're thinking that consciously. It's more like it's thinking you. It's unconscious or subconscious. Our best days are behind us. Imagine, what kind of plans do you come up with? What do you think is possible? How do you respond to innovation? How do you respond to a new CEO? How do you respond to any change initiative that comes up? Our best days are behind us. So you basically have a profound resignation that basically gives no chance, no matter what content you put into that organization, that context drives and has all the votes and basically drives the future. So what we're going to do in the session, if you allow me, will be to see if we could reveal and unconceal that underlying background conversation that drives any organization, even the best ones.
And I guess culture is an interesting one because these things aren't linear. It's not that culture is separate from strategy. Ultimately, your culture influences the strategy you design, and your strategy is also the output of your culture. I'm just interested then to ask, are you beginning to see a situation where a core strategy becomes to build a culture of a particular type because you have identified that it is your culture that will define your success and your pathway rather than the strategy itself?
Yeah, exactly. So basically, you basically have to find a way to integrate those two, right? It's not like one comes first and one comes later. You have to constantly look. Is there something that I call the kind of immune system of the organization, right? So the organization has a certain immune system that guards against change. Mm-hmm. And let's face it, the incentive structure is usually set up in a way that it produces more of the same, right? The top people in the organization got to the top by basically having the status quo that is there right now. They benefit the most from the status quo. So why should they change course? They have no incentive to change course. It's very rare that somebody comes along like a Gorbachev who basically says, I'm going to impose change from above, even if it costs me my job, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that takes an enormous leadership to take that risk. And so what you have to do is be aware of that immune system and to look at culture all the time and to see what kind of short-term projects could we do that would test a new cultural approach, a new way of doing things, or that would maybe assault one of those taboos that we cannot accept, or that you're not allowed to talk about or not allowed to touch. And that's how I would constantly look at culture. But obviously, you have to produce results, right? So we're not talking about culture for culture's sake.
Yeah.
You do a short-term project where you pilot some new approach and it has to produce results, right? Because otherwise the strategy is worthless. So I'm not talking about, culture regardless of what the strategic outcomes are. So that's why I'm saying you constantly have to look at both.